The military outpost on 7 sat at the edge of known space. It was a cold world with gray skies and mountains that stretched beyond the clouds. The Galactic Coalition had built this base 5 years ago to watch the border and keep peace in the region. Soldiers from many species lived and trained here together. They shared meals, shared duties, and sometimes shared stories. But they did not always share respect. They were the largest species on the base. They stood nearly 8 feet tall with thick blue skin that could stop a blade. Their eyes glowed faint yellow in the dark. They were born warriors, raised from childhood to fight, and they believed no other species could match them in battle. They were smaller but fast. Their scaled bodies could move like shadows, and they took pride in their speed and cunning. Both species looked at humans the way a wolf might look at a rabbit, curious perhaps but never impressed. Staff Sergeant Jack had served in the Coalition military for 22 years. He was 43 years old with gray at his temples and scars on his hands. He had fought in 3 colonial wars and survived things that would break most soldiers. But none of that mattered to the aliens on 7. To them, he was just another human. Small, soft, and unremarkable. Jack did not mind. He had learned long ago that respect was not given, it was earned, and he had nothing to prove to anyone. The recreation hall was the largest room on the base. Soldiers gathered there after duty shifts to relax, play games, and talk. They often gathered in one corner, their deep voices rumbling like distant thunder. They preferred the shadows near the walls. The humans, only 12 of them on a base of 300, usually kept to themselves. On this particular evening, Jack sat alone at a small table near the window. He held a cup of coffee in his hands and watched the snow fall outside. The mountains looked beautiful in the fading light. He thought about his home back on Earth, a small town in Montana where the winters were just as cold. He had not been back in 6 years. Across the room, a group of soldiers had discovered something interesting. One of them, a young warrior named, had accessed the human cultural database on his tablet. He was reading aloud to his companions, and they were laughing. "Listen to this," said, his yellow eyes bright with amusement. "The humans write about warriors called Spartans. They say 300 of them held a mountain pass against an army of 100,000. 300 against 100,000. The other burst into laughter. One of them slapped the table so hard it cracked. "Impossible," another warrior said. "No species is that foolish, and no species is that strong." "It gets better," continued. "They also write about warriors called berserkers. These humans would become so angry in battle that they felt no pain. They would fight without armor, screaming like animals, and kill dozens of enemies before falling." More laughter filled the room. Even some of them turned to listen, their thin lips curling into smiles. "Human propaganda," a scout said. "They write these stories to feel better about being weak. Every prey species does the same." Jack heard every word. He did not move. He did not react. He simply sipped his coffee and continued watching the snow. Lieutenant Amy Dawson walked over and sat across from him. She was 31 years old with short brown hair and sharp eyes. She had served under Jack for 3 years and trusted him more than anyone else on the base. "You hear that?" she asked quietly. "I hear it," Jack replied. "And you are just going to sit here?" Jack set down his coffee and looked at her. His eyes were calm, almost peaceful. "What would you have me do, Lieutenant? Stand up and give a speech? Challenge them to a fight?" "Something," Amy said. "Anything. They are mocking our entire species." "Let them mock," Jack said. "Words are just air. They do not change what is true." Amy leaned forward. "And what is true?" Jack was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window again at the snow and the mountains and the darkening sky. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "Every species has a story it tells itself. They believe they are the greatest warriors in the galaxy because their bodies are strong. They believe they are the best hunters because they are fast. These stories give them comfort. They give them identity." He turned back to Amy. Humans have different stories. We tell ourselves that a small group of determined people can change the course of history. We tell ourselves that courage matters more than size, that will matters more than strength. They think these are lies because they cannot imagine such things, but you and I know the truth. What truth? Amy asked. That our stories are not fantasies, Jack said. They are memories. Every myth, every legend, every tale of impossible bravery, they all happened. Humans really did hold mountain passes against impossible odds. Humans really did fight through pain that should have killed them. We did these things because we had no other choice. We were never the strongest or the fastest, so we became the most stubborn. Amy smiled slightly. So why not tell them that? Jack shook his head. Because words prove nothing. They will believe what they want to believe until they see the truth with their own eyes, and I hope, for their sake, that day never comes. He finished his coffee and stood up. The laughter from the table continued behind him. Where are you going? Amy asked. To bed, Jack said. We have patrol duty in 3 days. I want to be rested. He walked out of the recreation hall without looking back. They did not notice him leave. They were too busy reading more human stories and finding more reasons to laugh. They read about the siege of Stalingrad, where humans fought building by building in frozen hell. They read about the beaches of Normandy, where humans ran into gunfire because the mission demanded it. They read about pilots who crashed their planes into enemy ships, choosing certain death over retreat. And they laughed at all of it. They did not know that in 3 days they would stop laughing forever. They did not know that the small, quiet human who had just left the room would show them what those old stories really meant. They did not know that some of them would die, and the ones who survived would never see humans the same way again. The snow continued to fall outside. The mountain stood silent and cold, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the base, enemies were gathering, preparing an ambush that would change everything. But for now, they laughed, and Jack slept peacefully, dreaming of mountains and snow and a home he might never see again. The patrol left the base at dawn on the 3rd day. The sky was gray and heavy with clouds that promised more snow. 18 soldiers marched into the mountains, their boots crunching on frozen ground. 12 warriors led the formation, their massive bodies moving with practiced discipline. 4 scouts ranged ahead and to the sides, their sharp eyes watching for danger. And at the rear walked 2 humans, Staff Sergeant Jack and Corporal Danny. Danny was 24 years old, a medic fresh from training on Earth. This was his first deployment to an alien world, and everything still amazed him. The purple rocks, the strange plants, the massive soldiers he marched alongside. He had grown up reading stories about space and aliens, and now he was living inside one of those stories. He could not stop smiling. Jack watched the young man with quiet amusement. He remembered being that young, that eager, that unaware of how quickly things could go wrong. He hoped Danny would never have to learn those lessons the hard way. But hope was a fragile thing in places like this. The patrol commander was the same who had laughed at human stories 3 nights ago. He was young for a commander, only 30 cycles old, but his family had produced warriors for generations. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never truly been tested. Jack had seen that confidence before, in soldiers of every species. It usually did not survive the first real battle. They marched for 6 hours through narrow valleys and steep passes. The mountains rose around them like walls, blocking out the sky. The wind grew colder as they climbed higher. Jack kept his eyes moving, watching the ridges above, watching the shadows between rocks. Something felt wrong. The silence was too deep. The animals that usually scattered at their approach were nowhere to be seen. He moved forward until he walked beside. "Commander," Jack said quietly, "we should change our route." Glanced down at him with mild annoyance. "Why would we do that?" "This valley is too narrow. The ridges give perfect cover for an ambush. If enemies are watching us, this is exactly where they would strike." Snorted, "The insurgents are cowards. They attack supply convoys and isolated outposts. They do not have the courage to face a full patrol. They might if they have enough numbers and enough surprise, Jack said. Your concern is noted, human, said, turning away. But I will not waste time on detours because you have nervous feelings. Jack said nothing more. He had given his warning. That was all he could do. They continued into the valley. The walls grew steeper, the path grew narrower, and then the world exploded. Plasma fire rained down from both ridges. Bright blue bolts of energy slammed into the patrol from above, burning through armor and flesh. The first volley killed 4 before anyone could react. A scout fell with a hole through his chest. The air filled with screams and the smell of burning. Jack tackled Danny to the ground and rolled them both behind a large boulder. Plasma bolts hissed past them, close enough to feel the heat. Stay down, Jack ordered. Do not move until I tell you. He raised his head just enough to see the situation. It was bad. The patrol had been caught in the open with no cover. They had the high ground on both sides, at least 15 or 20 shooters that he could count. They were trying to return fire, but they were exposed and falling fast. Had taken a plasma bolt to his lower torso. He lay behind a rock formation, clutching the wound with both hands. Blue blood seeped between his fingers. 2 of his soldiers crouched beside him, trying to provide cover fire, but they were running low on ammunition. The scouts had scattered into whatever shadows they could find. They were fast enough to dodge some shots, but not all. One more fell as Jack watched, hit while trying to reach better cover. Within 5 minutes, half the patrol was dead or dying. The survivors were pinned down in small groups, unable to move, unable to fight effectively. They kept firing from their safe positions above, slowly picking them off. Jack crawled to where Danny lay flat against the frozen ground. "How many wounded can you reach?" he asked. Danny's face was pale with fear, but his voice was steady. "Maybe 3 or 4 if I stay low, but I cannot do much without supplies, and my kit is back there." He pointed to where a dead lay in the open. The medical supplies were scattered near the body. "Forget the kit," Jack said. "Just keep the wounded alive, stop the bleeding, keep them breathing. That is all." He looked around the boulder again. The situation was getting worse. They were starting to move down the slopes, closing in for the kill. They knew the patrol was broken. They were taking their time, enjoying the hunt. Jack made his way to, crawling through the dirt and snow. Plasma bolts struck the ground near him, but he did not slow down. When he reached the commander, he saw the wound clearly. It was bad, but not fatal if treated soon. Said through clenched teeth, "I did not listen, you were right." "That does not matter now," Jack said. "What matters is getting out of here." "There is no way out," said. "The path back is blocked. They have shooters covering it. The path forward leads deeper into the valley with no exit. We are trapped." Jack looked up at the ridges. The positions were well chosen. The valley walls were steep, almost vertical in places. Only a fool would try to climb them under fire. But there was one section, maybe 200 meters away, where the cliff was rough with handholds and ledges. It led directly up to the main enemy position on the eastern ridge. If someone could reach the top, they could attack from behind, create confusion, break their formation. It might give the survivors enough time to escape. "I see one way," Jack said quietly. Followed his gaze to the cliff face. His yellow eyes widened. "That is not a way," he said. "That is death. No one can climb that, especially not under fire. You would be killed before you reached halfway." "Maybe," Jack said, "but staying here is certain death. At least climbing gives us a chance." Us shook his head. "I cannot climb, I can barely move." "Not us," Jack said, "me." He began removing his armor, stripping down to his basic uniform. He kept his combat knife and his sidearm, nothing else. The armor would only slow him down. Stared at him. "You cannot be serious. You are human, your bodies are fragile. One hit and you are dead." Jack smiled slightly. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had made peace with what he was about to do. "Let me tell you something about humans," he said. "We have been climbing mountains since before we learned to write. We climbed them for food, for safety, for the simple need to see what was on the other side. Climbing is in our blood. It is what we do." He looked up at the cliff one more time, measuring the distance, planning his route. "Tell your soldiers to give me covering fire when I start moving, and when you hear shooting from above, get everyone out through the back path. Do not wait for me." Opened his mouth to argue, but Jack was already gone, moving low and fast toward the base of the cliff. The climb was about to begin. Jack reached the base of the cliff and pressed himself flat against the cold rock. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. He had done difficult things before. He had survived situations that should have killed him. This was just one more. He looked up at the cliff face. 200 feet of rough stone, ledges, and cracks. In normal conditions, with proper equipment and no one shooting at him, it would be a challenging but manageable climb. These were not normal conditions. He had no rope, no harness, no protection. And somewhere above him, soldiers were waiting to kill him. He took a deep breath and began to climb. The first 30 feet were easy. The rock had good handholds and he moved quickly, pulling himself up with practiced efficiency. His fingers found cracks and edges that most eyes would miss. His feet pressed against small bumps and ridges that gave just enough support. He had learned to climb as a boy in Montana, scrambling up cliffs with his friends for fun. Later, the military had trained him properly, but the foundation had always been there, built into his muscles and bones. Behind him, he heard shouting orders. The surviving began firing at the positions, trying to draw attention away from the climbing human. Plasma bolts flew back and forth above the valley floor. The noise was tremendous, echoing off the mountain walls like thunder. Jack was 50 feet up when the first shot came close. A plasma bolt struck the rock 3 feet to his left, leaving a glowing crater in the stone. He did not flinch. He did not stop. He kept climbing, hand over hand, foot after foot, his entire focus on the rock in front of him. They had spotted him. He could hear their harsh voices shouting above, could see shapes moving on the ridge. More shots came, but they were shooting downward at an angle, and the cliff face provided some protection. The bolts hit rock instead of flesh. Small victories. 80 feet. The handholds were getting smaller now. His fingers ached from gripping stone and his shoulders burned with effort. The cold wind cut through his thin uniform, stealing warmth from his body. He ignored it. Cold was just a feeling. Pain was just information. None of it mattered until the mission was complete. Danny watched from below through the scope of his rifle. He was not a skilled marksman, but he did what he could, firing at any who leaned too far over the edge. Most of his shots missed, but they forced the enemy to be cautious. Every second they spent ducking was a second Jack could keep climbing. "He is actually doing it," Danny whispered to himself. "He is actually climbing that thing." One of the wounded lay nearby, his leg badly burned but his eyes still sharp. He watched the human ascending the cliff with something like wonder on his scaled face. "I have heard stories," they said, "about humans climbing the highest mountains on there, mountains so tall that the air itself becomes poison. They climb them anyway, knowing they might die. I thought the stories were exaggerations." "They are not exaggerations," Danny said without looking away from his scope. "The mountain is called Everest. Humans have been climbing it for 200 years. Many died trying. They kept climbing anyway." "Why?" they asked. "What is at the top that is worth dying for?" Danny smiled grimly. "Nothing. There is nothing at the top but rock and ice and thin air. They climb it because it is there, because it challenges them, because something inside humans refuses to accept that anything is impossible." 100 feet. Jack's arms were screaming now. His fingers were bleeding where the rough stone had torn the skin, but he was more than halfway up and they were getting nervous. He could see them above, trying to get a clear shot, arguing with each other about what to do. They had never seen anything like this. Their species did not climb. They attacked from positions of strength and fled when the advantage was lost. The idea of climbing toward danger, toward certain death, made no sense to them. A plasma bolt finally found its mark. It grazed Jack's right shoulder, burning through uniform and skin. The pain was immediate and intense, a white-hot fire that spread down his arm. He lost his grip with his right hand and swung outward, hanging by his left hand alone, his feet scrambling for purchase on the stone. The soldiers below saw him hanging there and thought he was finished, closed his eyes, unable to watch the human fall to his death. But Jack did not fall. He gritted his teeth against the pain and swung his body back toward the cliff. His right hand found a crack in the rock and held on despite the burning in his shoulder. His feet found ledges. He stabilized himself against the stone and stayed there for a moment, breathing hard, blood running down his arm. Then he started climbing again. 120 feet. The wound was bad. He could feel blood soaking through his uniform, feel his right arm growing weaker with each pull. But he could also see the top now, could see the edge of the ridge just 40 feet above him. He was close, so close. The above were panicking. They had never seen a prey animal that would not stop. They fired wildly, their shots going wide, hitting rock instead of flesh. One of them tried to lean far over the edge to get a better angle, and Danny's shot caught him in the throat. The body tumbled past Jack on its way down, so close he could have touched it. 30 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet. Jack reached the top as the last light of day faded from the sky. He pulled himself over the edge and lay flat on the cold ground, gasping for breath. His shoulder was on fire. His arms felt like they were made of water. But he was up. He had made it. He allowed himself 5 seconds to rest. Then he drew his combat knife and his sidearm, and he stood up. The position was just ahead. He could see them clearly now, maybe 15 or 16 soldiers spread out along the ridge, all of them focused on shooting down at the valley. They had not yet realized he was behind them. Jack felt something shift inside him. The pain in his shoulder faded to a distant whisper. The exhaustion in his arms disappeared. His vision seemed to sharpen, every detail becoming clear and precise. His heartbeat slowed to a steady, powerful rhythm. This was the place he had visited before in other battles, in other desperate moments. The old soldiers called it different things: battle rage, combat focus, the zone. Jack did not have a name for it. He only knew that when it came, he was capable of things that should not be possible. He thought about the laughing at human myths. He thought about the berserkers who felt no pain. He thought about the warriors throughout human history who had faced impossible odds and refused to yield. Those warriors were not myths. They were his ancestors, and their blood ran in his veins. Jack walked toward the enemy position. His knife was in one hand. His sidearm was in the other, and in his eyes was something that they had never seen before. Something that would be the last thing many of them ever saw. The first died without making a sound. Jack came up behind him like a shadow, clamped a hand over his mouth, and drove his knife into the base of the skull. The body dropped silently. Jack took the fallen soldier's rifle and kept moving. They were spread out along the ridge in groups of 2 and 3, each group focused on their own firing position. They communicated through short-range radios, but in the noise of battle, they did not notice when one group went silent. Jack used that weakness. He moved from position to position, killing quickly and quietly, reducing their numbers before they knew what was happening. 4 dead, then 6, then 8. The 9th turned at the wrong moment and saw Jack standing over the body of his companion. The alien opened his mouth to scream a warning. Jack shot him twice in the chest before any sound could escape. But the shots were loud. The other heard them and understood that something was wrong. They stopped firing at the valley below and turned to face this new threat. In the fading light, they saw a single human standing among their dead, blood dripping from his knife, a stolen rifle in his hands. For a moment, no one moved. They could not understand what they were seeing. This small, soft creature had climbed an impossible cliff under fire, survived a wound that should have stopped him, and killed half their force without raising an alarm. It made no sense. Nothing in their experience had prepared them for this. Jack did not give them time to think about it. He raised the rifle and started shooting. The first three fell before they could react. The others scattered, diving for cover, trying to regroup. But the ridge was narrow, and there was not much cover to be found. Jack walked forward through the chaos, firing steadily, placing each shot with cold precision. His rifle ran empty. He threw it at the nearest, hitting him in the face, then drew his sidearm and kept shooting. A plasma bolt burned past his ear. Another grazed his ribs, adding a new line of fire to the pain he was already carrying. He did not slow down. He did not stop. The soldiers in the valley below heard the gunfire and screaming from above. They looked up and saw muzzle flashes on the ridge, saw bodies falling, saw one small figure moving through the position like death itself. "What is happening up there?" one of the surviving asked. Was watching through a targeting scope. His yellow eyes were wide. "The human," he said. "The human is killing them all." Danny was already on his feet, gathering the wounded. "You heard, Sergeant. When the shooting starts above, we move. Everyone who can walk, help those who cannot. We go now." The survivors began their retreat through the back path. Was too heavy to walk on his own, but two soldiers lifted him between them and carried him. They moved ahead as scouts, checking for any enemies who might be blocking their escape. There were none. All the attention was focused on the single human who was tearing through their position on the ridge. Above, Jack's sidearm clicked empty. He was down to his knife now, and there were still 4 left. They had regrouped behind a rock formation and were firing at him in coordinated bursts. He was pinned behind a dead body, using it as cover, waiting for an opening. The pain was catching up with him now. His shoulder wound had reopened from the fighting. The graze on his ribs was deeper than he had first thought. Blood was running down his side and soaking into his pants. He was getting dizzy. His vision was starting to blur at the edges. But he could not stop. Not yet. Not while there were still enemies who could threaten his people. He waited until the pause to reload, then burst from cover and charged them. The aliens were not prepared for a direct assault. They expected the human to retreat, to find better cover, to behave like a sensible creature that wanted to live. Instead, this madman was running straight at them with nothing but a knife, screaming something in his strange human language. Jack hit the first before any of them could fire. His knife found the throat, and hot alien blood sprayed across his face. He spun and threw himself at the second, tackling the creature to the ground and driving his blade into its chest again and again. The third tried to aim at him, but Jack grabbed the rifle barrel and shoved it aside, then headbutted the alien hard enough to crack bone. As the staggered back, Jack took his knife and finished him. The fourth and final enemy ran. He turned his back and tried to flee down the ridge, away from this nightmare creature that should not exist. Jack picked up a fallen rifle, checked that it had ammunition, and shot the runner in the back. The body tumbled down the slope and lay still. Silence fell over the ridge. The battle was over. Jack stood alone among the dead, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He counted the bodies. 17, all dead. Some killed quietly in the opening moments, some shot during the firefight, some killed with nothing but a knife and desperate fury. He looked down at his hands. They were covered in blood, some of it blue from some of it red from his own wounds. They were shaking now. The strange calm that had carried him through the fight was fading, and the pain was rushing back with terrible force. He could hear voices below, Danny's voice calling his name. The survivors had made it to the secondary path. They were safe. Jack tried to walk toward the edge of the ridge, but his legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees, then fell forward onto his hands. The world was spinning around him. He had lost too much blood. His body was finally reaching its limits. But he was not done yet. was wounded and could not walk. The path down was long and dangerous. The patrol needed everyone who could still move. Jack forced himself back to his feet. It took 3 tries and he had to grab a rock to pull himself up, but he managed it. He stood there swaying, breathing hard, willing himself to keep moving. Then he started walking down the ridge, one painful step at a time. When he reached the valley floor 20 minutes later, the survivors stared at him in silence. He was covered in blood from head to toe. His uniform was torn and burned in a dozen places. His shoulder wound was open and raw, and the gash on his ribs had turned his entire left side red. His face was pale from blood loss, and his eyes had a distant look, like he was seeing something beyond the present moment. But he was still standing, still moving, still fighting. He walked over to where lay propped against a rock, and looked down at the wounded commander. "The path is clear," Jack said. His voice was hoarse and barely above a whisper. "We need to move. More will come." Then, before anyone could stop him, he bent down and lifted across his shoulders. The weighed nearly 400 pounds. Jack weighed less than 200, but somehow, impossibly, he straightened up with the alien commander on his back and started walking toward the base. No one spoke. No one laughed at human myths anymore. They simply followed the bleeding human soldier who carried their commander through the darkness, step by impossible step, until the lights of the outpost appeared in the distance. Jack collapsed the moment he passed through the gates of the outpost. His legs simply stopped working and he went down with still on his back. Soldiers rushed forward to catch them both, shouting for medics, shouting for stretchers, shouting in a dozen different languages. Danny was at Jack's side in seconds, checking his wounds, calling out vital signs to the medical team. The sergeant's pulse was weak and irregular. His blood pressure was dangerously low. His skin was cold and gray, and his breathing was shallow. He was dying right there on the frozen ground. They rushed him to the medical bay and worked on him for 6 hours straight. The doctors sealed his wounds, replaced his lost blood, pumped him full of drugs to fight infection and keep his heart beating. 3 times during that night, his heart stopped. 3 times they brought him back. By morning, he was stable but unconscious. The doctors said he might wake up in a few days or a few weeks, or he might never wake up at all. The human body had limits, and Jack had pushed far beyond them. Recovered quickly. His species healed fast, and within 3 days he was walking again, though slowly. He spent most of that time sitting beside Jack's bed in the medical bay, watching the unconscious human, thinking about what he had seen. The other survivors told their stories to anyone who would listen. They described the ambush and the hopeless situation. They described the human who stripped off his armor and climbed an impossible cliff under fire. They described the sounds from the ridge, the gunfire and screaming that went on for what felt like hours. And they described the bloody figure who walked down from the mountain carrying their commander like he weighed nothing at all. The story spread through the outpost within hours. Within days, it had reached other coalition bases. Within weeks, it was being told across the sector. A human soldier, one small human against 17 enemy fighters, armed with nothing but a knife and a pistol and a refusal to die. They stopped reading human histories as jokes. They began reading them as warnings. 2 weeks after the ambush, Jack finally opened his eyes. He woke slowly, confused by the white ceiling and the beeping machines and the tubes running into his arms. For a moment, he did not know where he was or what had happened. Then the memories came back and he closed his eyes again. "You are awake." Jack turned his head and saw sitting in a chair beside the bed. The look different somehow. Smaller, maybe, or perhaps just humbler. "How long?" Jack asked. His voice was rough from disuse. 14 days, said. "The doctors were not sure you would wake at all. Your body suffered damage that should have been fatal. You lost more blood than humans are supposed to have in their bodies. Your heart stopped 3 times. Jack managed a weak smile. "Only 3. Did not smile back. He leaned forward in his chair, his yellow eyes fixed on the human's face. "I have spent these 2 weeks reading," he said. "Your human histories, your stories of war and survival. I read about a place called Thermopylae, where 300 warriors truly did hold a pass against a vast army. I read about a place called Stalingrad, where humans fought for months in frozen ruins, starving and bleeding and refusing to surrender. I read about pilots who flew burning planes into enemy ships rather than retreat. I read about soldiers who fell on explosive to save their companions." He paused, struggling with something he did not know how to express. "I thought these were exaggerations," he continued. "Propaganda designed to make your species seem more impressive than it really was. But then I watched you climb that cliff. I watched you kill 17 enemies with your bare hands while wounded and exhausted. I watched you carry me for miles when you should have been dead." His voice dropped lower. "I do not understand. Your bodies are fragile, your senses are dull. You have no claws, no natural armor, nothing that should make you dangerous. How does your species produce warriors like you? What makes humans capable of such things?" Jack was quiet for a long moment. He stared at the ceiling, thinking about the question. It was one he had asked himself many times over the years. What was it about humans that allowed them to do impossible things? "We are afraid," he finally said. "All the time. Every human carries fear inside them, fear of death, fear of pain, fear of failure. We are not naturally brave. We have to choose to be brave every single time, and that choice is never easy." He turned to look at. "But millions of years ago, our ancestors learned something. They learned that fear does not have to control you. They learned that the body is just a machine, and the mind can push it far beyond its normal limits. They learned that when everything is lost and there is no hope left, the only thing to do is attack." "But why?" asked. "Why attack when retreat would save your life?" "Because retreat does not always save your life," Jack said. "Sometimes it just delays your death, and sometimes the only way forward is through. Our ancestors learned that lesson in a world full of predators bigger and stronger and faster than us. We survived by being stubborn, by refusing to give up, by keeping going when every rational instinct said to stop." He smiled slightly, though it looked more tired than happy. "You asked how my species produces warriors like me. The truth is, every human has the potential for what I did. Most never need to unlock it. Most live their whole lives without ever facing a moment that demands everything they have. But the potential is always there, sleeping, waiting. When the moment comes, any human can become what I became on that ridge." Sat back in his chair. He looked at the small human lying in the hospital bed, covered in bandages, barely strong enough to lift his head. And for the first time in his life, he felt something he had never felt before when looking at a human. He felt respect, and perhaps a little fear. "Your myths are not propaganda," said slowly. "They are not exaggerations or children's tales. They are records, records of what your species is capable of when pushed to the limit." "Yes," Jack said. "They are warnings." "In a way." Was silent for a moment, then he shook his head. "No, not warnings. Warnings are meant to frighten. Your stories are something else. They are meant to inspire, to remind your people who they are and what they can do." Jack closed his eyes. He was tired, so tired. But before he slept, he said one more thing. "They are promises. Promises that no matter how bad things get, no matter how impossible the situation seems, a human will find a way. Our ancestors made those promises with their blood and their lives, and every generation since has kept them." In the months that followed, the story of Staff Sergeant Jack spread far beyond the sector. It became legend among the coalition forces. Human soldiers, once dismissed as fragile and unremarkable, were viewed with new eyes. Not with pity, not with contempt, but with the kind of respect you give to someone who might be more dangerous than they appear. And in recreation halls across the galaxy, alien soldiers began to read human histories more carefully. They learned about Thermopylae and Stalingrad and Normandy. They learned about warriors who fought against impossible odds and refused to yield. They learned that humans had been forged in struggle, shaped by a world that offered no mercy and accepted no excuses. And they learned the most important lesson of all. Never mock a human's ancestors in front of a human soldier. Because the myths were never myths. They were promises. And humans always keep their promises.